All right, welcome to my presentation on essay number 2, Blacks Are Naturally Good Athletes, The Myth of a Biological Basis for Race. It was written by Daniel Buffington and it will be presented by me, Faustino Gonzalez. First, a little background. I chose this essay for this presentation because it was, well, one, I'm a lifelong sports fan, so that kind of dragged me to it because of the title, and two, because it was the first of the essays that really made me look at a way that I thought about race, something that some long-standing beliefs that I've held for a while, and it helped me to change my worldview on that. So hopefully my presentation can help other people do the same. Okay, so first we'll talk about the main purpose of the essay as well as some of the conclusions that Mr. Buffington came to in his writing. So the main purpose of the essay is to dispel myths about biological differences in race. So what do I mean by that? Basically, Mr. Buffington asserts that race is not biological in origin and in fact is entirely a social construct, which I have to say the scientific evidence strongly supports. In his article, he states that there is less than a 0.1% differentiation in most genetic profiles across all peoples, and I have to say it's pretty compelling stuff. The differences in the races can be traced mostly to differences in location and geography and the distance between different races more so than actual DNA itself. So again, to restate, his main purpose was to dispel myths about the biological differences in races, and to do so he showed science which backed it up. DNA evidence basically shows that the different races are more similar than dissimilar across the spectrum. Next, we'll talk about some of the key concepts you have to understand to really grasp what Mr. Buffington means when he says that race is a social construct. First, he has two different definitions of race. One is the biological definition of race, which is the interspecies differences measured by genotypic or phenotypic variations. Now, to better understand that definition, you have to understand what a genotype and a phenotype are. A genotype is simply the genetic makeup of an organism, whereas the phenotype are the more physically observable and measurable characteristics of an organism. The best way that I can think to really explain what that means is you can easily tell a difference between a dolphin and a manatee just by looking at them and observing their physical characteristics or phenotypes. However, if you have two subspecies of dolphins, you may not be able at first glance to be able to tell the difference between them. So therefore, you'd have to do a DNA test to find out their genotypes, and then you could accurately categorize them from there. Now contrast that to the social definition of race, which is a form of group identification including self-identification and social identification. So if the science doesn't point towards there being any biological difference in race, it follows that their race must come from society, that people have grouped different peoples based on their phenotype and have then assigned a value to that group of people. This usually comes in the form of a dominant race assigning value to people of other races, usually in a negative kind of way. And we'll go into that a little bit further in the presentation. Next, we'll talk about the main points of view that Mr. Buffington adopted when writing his essay. The first is that race is largely defined by society. Now, we've already kind of spoken about how the science points towards this being the case, but just to reiterate, there are minimal biological differences between races and between people, and this points to race being a mostly cultural, if not entirely societal construct. People have assigned different labels to different groups of people based on how they look and have then assigned those groups values. The second point of view that Mr. Buffington has adopted is that most racial differences can be explained by differences in location. So, the best way to think about that is where you grew up basically defines how you act and to a greater extent how you look and how you feel about certain things. A good example would be I don't want to butcher the name, so I'll just say the tribe of Indonesian free divers who are well known. They've been featured on different shows and in articles, but they have the ability to hold their breath for up to 5 minutes. This is basically developed over centuries of free dive fishing, and throughout time and tradition, they have honed this ability to be able to hold their breath for long periods of time as a way to more effectively and more efficiently fish. And contrast that to someone who grew up in sub-Saharan Africa, Egypt or Algeria. They would have no reason to have the ability to hold their breath for 5 minutes at a time, right? And is that because they are African versus Indonesian? No, it has nothing to do with that. It's simply due to the fact that one culture grew up free diving, the other one did not. It has nothing to do with the race of the people and everything to do with the location in which they were born and their ancestors' practices and the way they have subsisted for hundreds of years at this point. Okay, so in conclusion, we talked about the main purposes of the writing and the conclusions that Mr. Buffington came to. We talked about the key concepts needed to understand the essay, and we talked about the main points of view that were adopted in writing the essay. Before I wrap it up, I'd like to talk about the ramifications of the article and what would happen should we fail to take these kinds of lessons seriously versus the opposite. What would happen if we adopted the lessons and took them to heart? So first, the negative. If we fail to take these things seriously, people will continue to believe in unscientifically backed biological difference in races. And on the surface, that sounds not great, but overall harmless. But when you take it to its conclusion, its logical conclusion, that's exactly the kind of thing that people have used in the past to dehumanize groups. You think Nazi Germany jumps to mind, apartheid South Africa. The thing that they all had in common was using the perceived differences in groups to dehumanize and therefore make it okay to destroy other groups of people. So that's an extreme, but if you follow the rabbit hole down to its logical conclusion, that's where these kinds of things end, unfortunately. On the flip side, if we take these things seriously and really take them to heart and work our best to propagate the arguments, we would take true positive steps towards racial equality. We've made strides, but it's not enough. And these kinds of facts and findings are the building block, or one of the first building blocks that we can use to move towards a more equal and fair society that truly gives everyone the same opportunities to succeed. Thanks for listening.